Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to AP United States History. Today we're going to discuss the breakdown of political and social relationships within the British North American colonies that are happening right into the run-up of the French and Indian War. So, here are your main objectives for today. Take a pause to take them in, and let's dive in and tell our story. So, all of the colonial governments had developed a similar structure at this point to the one that had developed back in the beginning in Virginia, the whole House of Burgesses. Each of them had established their own charter of government. They had been appointed a royal governor by the king and then had elected colonial legislatures. As you know, as it notes here, New York now has their own codified charter, and every other colony had a specific charter of government by which they were operating under, each of which was basically a British government charter in miniature, in that the colonial legislature, elected by land-owning white men, and sometimes women, if you're talking about Pennsylvania, all of these colonies had these elected legislatures, and then there was a royal governor who was the executive who controlled and enforced the laws and appointed judges and ministers in government posts. By this point, most of the colonies were royal colonies recognized by the king, with the exception of Pennsylvania and Maryland, who were owned by wealthy individuals who'd been given grants from the king. We talked about that, William Penn, etc. So, supreme legislative authority is still under the king, but these colonial legislatures also have significant power and the power of the purse to collect money. So, James I, when James II came to power, he went back to a lot of the philosophies of his father, the whole idea of absolutism, and he decided, this is during Restoration England, in between Oliver Cromwell's Protectorate and then eventually the Glorious Revolution, James decided that he wanted to have more direct control over the colonies, and so he created this political thing called the Dominion of New England. Because, as we talked about in our mercantilist lesson, for the most part, the colonists were ignoring almost everything England was doing. And there were all these problems. They were avoiding the Navigation Acts. King Philip's War had just happened. Bacon's Rebellion had happened. There were constant mercantilist wars. And so the king felt like he needed a stronger hand. So he appointed a guy named Edmund Andros to become the governor of this new political organization. And he is then going to send out his agents to try to take direct control over most of these northern colonies. The Dominion of New England was supposed to have all of New Jersey, Connecticut, New York, Massachusetts, Plymouth, Rhode Island, and the northern part of Massachusetts, what is today Maine. But if you had to guess how the colonists are going to feel about this, yeah. You tell a bunch of Puritans in Boston that they have to rejoin with the people of Rhode Island. I mean, why does Rhode Island exist in the first place? It's because they didn't want to be part of Boston. And so all the colonies go into immediate rebellion with the exception of Connecticut, which just sort of quietly takes it. In Boston, they take the original colony charter and famously hide it in an oak so it can't be confiscated. Rhode Island goes into immediate rebellion and refuses to recognize any of the king's authority. And in New York, you have something called, so here's Boston's revolt, and Edmund Andros, his agents are driven from the city almost immediately. And in New York, Edmund Andros himself, because he was going to set himself up in New York City as the place where he was going to rule from, his seat of power. And a guy named Captain Jacob Leisler grabs him, seizes control of the city. The city rises up, arrests Andros, and he never really is able to exert any real power. Leisler's rebellion is sort of about liberty against tyranny, although, as this last paragraph states, quote, "And though Captain Leisler had at first so violently opposed the collecting of revenue, alleging it unlawful, as soon as his wines were landed and he got into some power, he forthwith set himself up for the collecting of revenue, allowing him a great salary and all the prerequisites of this office." And so, although everyone hated Edmund Andros, Jacob Leisler alienated everyone pretty quickly, and in the end, he was finally arrested and executed. So what's the effect of all of this? Well, the Dominion of New England fell apart immediately and wasn't a real political entity. But since it nullified all the colonial charters, every colony had to more or less figure out their own system of government again. And so we started to see some consolidation. And what we started to see is that the British really had no ability to exert power over the colonies. Quote, The Assembly refused to admit any amendment to any money bill or in any part of bill, so the bill must pass as it came from the Assembly, or all the supplies granted for the support of government and most urgent services will be lost. Secondly, it appears that they must take the payment of military forces passing under the muster rolls into their own hands by naming committees for these purposes in the Act. And thirdly, by granting the salaries of the officers personally by name and not to the officer for the time being, any persons appointed to any office, his salary must depend on the approbation for the appointment. So what colonial legislatures start doing is they start using their ability to raise money to control government officials, because the only ones who can raise money are these colonial legislatures, and so the militias, the judges, all these other people are dependent on their salary is completely dependent on these legislatures, and so their loyalty starts to switch from the royal governors, who are ostensibly appointing them, to the people who are lining their pockets, the colonial legislatures. And so we start seeing, again, the colonists taking more and more control, and anytime the British push back against this, they find a way to sort of undermine British authority. So there's this constant battle between royal governors and colonial assemblies. The royal governor, as we mentioned, being the sort of representative of the king. And the other issue that we start to see is property-owning men make up a large percentage of people within the colonies. And so because there's so much land available, unlike in England, where only the wealthiest can vote and participate in government, in the colonies, lots more people can. But that starts to change over time. The other thing that's really important is because so many people can participate in government, everyone needs to be educated. Having an educated voting population is absolutely essential to a functioning republic. And so this concept of Republican motherhood becomes central to the American colonial experience. Because the sons are going to grow up to be eventual leaders and voters, and the women are going to grow up to theoretically have more sons, everyone needs to be educated in the principles of liberty, in their rights as Englishmen, and in the principles of the Enlightenment and government. And so, is it a step forward for women's rights? Yeah, it is. It's a tiny step forward, and clearly only related to the men that the women are related to, but it still is a step forward for women's rights. We also see another trial in which British authority is questioned, the Zenger trial. This was about a newspaper in New York who was criticizing the governor. The governor then sued him for libel. And the judge ruled against the governor, arguing that as long as the things that a newspaper prints are true, they're not illegal. And so it protected the freedom of the press, and it allowed increasing criticism of British government and government in general. And so this is going to become also the Zenger trial makes freedom of the press an enshrined value in American history. Here's a short narrative from the case. And, quote, the attorney, save Mr. Attorney the trouble of examining his witnesses to that point, and I do confess that he both printed and published the two newspapers set forth in the information, and I hope in doing so he has committed no crime, because the information that he printed was true. We see significant westward expansion during this time period in order to find more land to settle and to ensure that next generations can support themselves. But this is going to lead to increasing tension with Native Americans and also increasing tension with the French, which is going to come to a head at the beginning of next unit. As the population grows and people push into the Appalachian Mountains, the land that they are settling on is less fertile and less productive, which is going to become problematic. And as more and more people have more kids, they start subdividing their land further and further. And as these kids, as the society gets better established, have a higher likelihood of growing up to adulthood, this becomes somewhat problematic. And so the demand for land becomes one of the key issues in this sort of, in the later colonial period here. We're also starting to see the breakdown of social structures and social control. The rise of arranged marriages start to become less common, and young people start getting together for crazy reasons like love and affection. So that's strange. And as we can see here, we start to get a lot of people who either do not have a lot of land, or even worse, do not inherit any land. You can see over time the amount of land and the amount of property held by each of these families because they have so many sons, and then they have so many more sons, and they have to keep subdividing their land, keeps falling. And so we start to get the growth of either really poor or landless farmers living on the frontier who feel disconnected from the wealthy and powerful who still control the reins of government in the sort of eastern part of all the colonies. In almost every colony, we start to see a separation of church and state. Even in Massachusetts, the Halfway Covenant and the Second Great Awakening worked to break Puritan religious control. In the South, you have officially sanctioned Anglican churches, but there's also, because of the Second Great Awakening, a whole bunch of different groups of people in here and a whole bunch of different churches and different immigrants from different regions. And so this leads to massive conflict between the New Lights, the Old Lights, the Baptists, the Presbyterians, the Episcopalians, the Anglicans, and of course, the Puritans. And so all of this conflict leads to support falling away from state churches. And by the time of the American Revolution, we're going to more or less get rid of all our formal churches. Last piece is the regulator movement. The regulator movement is a movement that started in western North Carolina, with poor backcountry and landless farmers wanting to redistrict the colonial legislature to provide more representation to the growing regions on the frontier. Almost all the power was still held by the wealthy tidewater planters, and so the regulators refused to pay taxes, shut down courts, and armed themselves in order to fight back and try to demand greater political representation. And so, quote, "We will pay no taxes until we are satisfied that the law is applied to purposes therein. We will pay no officer any more fees than the law allows it, and until we are obliged to them," and stuff like that. This makes sense, yes? So, the regulator movement fails, but what it does represent is a growing willingness to arm yourself and to use violence in order to get greater government representation and to ensure that the government is listening to your demands. And so, we start to see the rise of armed militias throughout much of the colonies, which are seen as sort of a necessary in defense of the liberty of the individuals in the backcountry, and that, of course, in the tidewater, you need to raise a militia to protect yourself from potential violence from backcountry farmers. So a lot of it is very similar to Bacon's Rebellion. And so that brings us to our close here. Hopefully you can make sense of these objectives. And when we come back next time, we'll talk about the rise of slavery and the continued effect of that. So thank you for listening.